From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast.
One of the most frequently received phone calls in our office is who's right. People often ask me, I hear Neil Kinsey say this, I read Dr. Albrecht said this, and Kerry Reams and Lane Ingham and all the great minds working in eco-agriculture right now. And they say, well, who's right? And the answer probably is they all are. Nature is a complex beast, and you can push it and pull it and nudge it and tug at it, and we're impacting it in different ways. And so as you listen to speakers throughout the conference, the challenge is not to scribble down the pounds per acre specific recommendations that they tell you, but to try to gain an understanding of the whole system, the holistic picture of the farm. And when you understand how the inputs that are sold in the trade show area work, how all the various farming systems work together, that's when you're going to really, it'll come together for you. It'll build into a cohesive system for your own farm. And so to help you along the way in that big picture understanding, we've asked Jerry Brunetti to explain how nature works. And we figure that's a title big enough to drive a Mack truck through. And this is just the guy to do it. He's a formulator of nutraceuticals for livestock, formulator of fertilizers. He consults with farmers and growers all over the world. And I'll save my best joke about what he does for a living for this evening. But with that, we'll welcome Jerry Brunetti to the stage. And
Ciao. Good to be back. Really good to be back. This is going to be a conceptual talk, so if you're looking for pounds per acre, you're probably not going to get it. You have to wait to you talk to someone else about that. But the first slide sort of is self-explanatory about this talk is, can you get the feedback a little lessened? I wanted to get this idea up here. I've had this slide up in front of people before, and I wanted to get it up here again because it sort of reminds me of a movie that I saw many years ago. It's still one of my favorite movies that Paul Newman was in, called Cool Hand Luke. And if everybody have seen Cool Hand Luke? Anybody? Oh yeah, well, great. It's a classic. Well, you remember when Cool Hand Luke was taunting the prison guards and the warden, and he finally escaped, and then deliberately allowed himself to get caught and was brought back to the prison and got pretty much beat up by the warden's guards. And he was made an example of in front of the rest of the prisoners. And right before he was thrown down into the ditch, the warden said to everybody, he said, now what we have here is a failure to communicate. And I think that's what's going on with modern agriculture is a communication breakdown. And that's what I'm hoping to convey is in this talk is a conceptual idea as to how nature is so forgiving in the way that it communicates to itself, to each other, and to people on this roster up here. So what we have here on this family farm, and the family farm steward, hopefully, is the orchestrator of all of this information, the symphony. And I know a lot of farmers probably don't. You're going to wire me? He's going to wire me.
see if that doesn't work.
Better? Okay. So what we have here is just a handful. This certainly doesn't represent all that can be going on a real diverse farm, but you can see there's a handful of I call ecosystems that are interconnected. And what I see on the healthiest farms are as many of these as possible. And I finally found some information over the years that corroborates my very mundane observations that have been scientifically corroborated by. It's a good thing I'm not a comic. It's killing me. I think, can I talk like this? Can you hear me now? So anyway, I'm going to go down the list of these ecosystems through the eyes and ears and hands and minds of some other people. And I'm always supposed to stay left on this thing. And this is a favorite book of mine that I would encourage you to read. Lewis Thomas, who's the author of The Life of a Cell, wrote this quote, which pretty much sums it up. There is a tendency for living things to join up, establish linkages, live inside each other, return to earlier arrangements, get along wherever possible. It's a way of the world. Contrary to Darwinian predatory, rapacious competition, nature is quite conducive to trying to find ways to maximize compatibility and harmony. And so I guess the word cell was brought up in the introduction, so I'm gonna bring it up here. And you have an animal cell and a plant cell there. I'm not going to get into histology or how cytoplasm works or anything like that, but what I do want to say is that there was an Italian scientist by the name of Renato Nobili. And I'm not prejudiced. It's just to happen to turn out that Renato was a guy that discovered that cells emit permanent currents, and they actually make waveforms. The fluids, the molecules in the water of a cell allow for information to be imprinted on this water. And he also found that fluids in cells hold currents in patterns that correspond to brain waves. So there's an information thing going on here with these cells. And more importantly, it's not just the cells communicating with itself, it's communicating to other cells. And more interestingly enough to me, I just recently discovered in the last year that the mitochondria of the cell, which is the energy generator of the cell, actually has a different DNA than the rest of the cell. So according to Mr. Lewis Thomas, what we're talking about here is an organism that somehow invaded another organism to create a symbiotic relationship so that higher life forms could show up. Let's see if this happens. And one of the things that showed up is that production centers, there's 500,000 production centers in a cell. And cell activity is 100,000 per second. So that means if you have a 14 trillion or 15 trillion human cells, and there's 500 cell production centers producing enzymes and proteins, there's 100,000 activities in each cell every second. The real question is, how is it synchronized? How is all this activity synchronized? Because if it's not synchronized, things would come apart at the seams. And this is a guy who discovered some interesting things. Fritz Albert Popp was a renowned German scientist. And what he found out was that there's this thing called quantum coherence. And what that means is that these subatomic particles cooperate and they're interlinked by bands of electromagnetic radiation, and they resonate in waves. So the interesting thing about this, he did some cancer research, and he discovered in 1970, since I'm going to be talking about cancer, this is relevant also. In 1970, he discovered one of the causes of cancer being that they were experimenting with a chemical called benzo-A-pyrene, which is a polycyclic hydrocarbon, extremely carcinogenic substance, and it's used in cancer research because you can get a lot of research out of mammals exposing them to this chemical. And what he found out is he was experimenting with light, that he bombarded this chemical with a certain wavelength of ultraviolet light, that it would scramble the light and change the message of the light and send it out scrambled. In other words, what he found out is that these chemicals, every single cancer-causing chemical that he investigated, scrambled the message of the light. Then he theorized that all cells produce light in the form of photons, and discovered, rightfully so, that when you're contaminated with these chemicals, because he took another chemical called benzo-E-pyrene, not benzo-A-pyrene, but benzo-E-pyrene, very similar substance, almost identical, except it's an isomer difference, and he exposed it to ultraviolet light again, and nothing scrambled. So the cancer-causing chemicals consistently scrambled the light, screwed up the messages so that the cells could not communicate to one another. And so he made this presentment at a very prestigious cancer symposium in Germany in 1970, and it was compelling information, except the big lapse. The big question was, what's causing all of this to happen in the first place? In other words, what's the cause behind the cause? Where's the light coming from? What's orchestrating the light? And so he started investigating light and found out, much to the chagrin of his skeptics, that all living organisms, plants and animals, excrete or secrete or produce these photons. And he found out that the healthiest cells had a particular resonance at a particular frequency, at a particular volume of light, and unhealthy cells just the opposite. So he could actually quantify the health of a cell, the health of an organism, by looking at the frequency of the light that it was emitting. And so therefore, when a human, an animal, consumes a plant or any other food substance, what really ultimately is happening, assuming that material is not contaminated by these chemicals that scramble the light messages that the cells depend on to communicate, you become yourself a body of light. So food does make a difference in terms of consciousness. Now, I know that sounds a little bit far of a reach, but when you look at what really food is, and you look at what cells are, and how cells communicate to one another on all levels, from the microbe all the way up to the human, you recognize that in order for cellular communication to occur unimpeded, so that 500,000 activities or actions can occur in a cell per second, then you understand that you have to have as little interference as possible. Otherwise, you end up with, in the plant world, a thing called senescence, which is premature aging, and in humans, things like cancer. And one of the experiments he did, and he called this thing mitogenic resonance. He took some quartz crystals, tubes, and he filled half of them with live pig blood. And then he filled the other half of them with live pig, filled all four of them with live pig blood, And he challenged half of them with an antigen to cause an antibody reaction in the live pig blood. And the pig blood tubes that were challenged with the antigen, of course, got the antibody response, just like an allergic response. What was interesting was that the tubes nearby that did not get the antibody challenge also responded identically, as if they had gotten the antigen into the tube as well. So what was happening was the tubes that got exposed communicated, talked to the other cells and says, we have a problem here. We've been exposed to an antigen, produce antibodies. They did not have to be exposed physically. And that was what Pop was trying to say. It's not a matter of biochemical molecules bouncing around in the cell and having to come into collision with other biochemical molecules. That takes too much time. It's done on the light wave, and it's a big wave. And this quantum coherence that he called it is actually waveforms. And when you start getting the waveforms in harmony together, you get huge resonance. And when you get huge amounts of resonance, you get incredible amounts of vitality, and you get incredible amounts of resistance to challenges that we take for granted, like the flu that's going around right now, that everybody's running in hordes to get the flu vaccine. You know, their lights are going out. That's what's happened. And then this fella came along, a French scientist by the name of Jacques Vendening, and this guy proved that homeopathy works. And it was all accidental. He did the same thing that Pop did with the blood, except he had a lab assistant that made a mistake. It always happens this way, isn't it? It's like the Jekyll and Hyde story. It's always the accidental laboratory mistake, but it happens that way. It's always these accidents that occur. And she didn't put enough antigen in the challenging medium to get the antibody response, but they got an antibody response anyway. It was a very, very dilute solution. And so, lo and behold, he couldn't understand why there was a reaction, an antibody reaction to this. And so he got into this thing and found out over time that it was a matter of the water carrying. He said that water molecules organize themselves in a way, here's a quote that he says, to form patterns on which can be imprinted wave information, which explains how homeopathy works. So information, these waves can be imprinted on water, which says what the homeopaths have been saying for many, many years, that water has a memory if it's pure water. So he got completely lambasted. This guy also was a renowned scientist that won many awards in the scientific arena. And he got lambasted. But what they found out ultimately, when they did double-blind placebo studies on over 105 homeopathic challenges, they got very positive, conclusive, irrevocable results on 81 of the 105. That's pretty statistically significant. Homeopathy works. John Todd was a protege of Dr. Buckminster Fuller, the geodesic dome guy, and also the guy who founded the New Alchemy Institute up in Woods Hole, Mass. Back in the 60s and 70s, I guess it was. And Todd ended up doing some of his own work about nature, how it communicates. And he came up with this patented system called the living machines. And what these are waste treatment bioremediation systems. The living machines are systems that he can go into an industrial Superfund site, municipal sewage treatment plant, any kind of commercial or industrial facility that has wastewater. And he can run these, he can run the water or the effluent into this system that consists of these cells. And each of these cells is a different ecosystem with different plants, microbes, mollusks, even fish on the lower end of them. And he wires all of the cells together with ductwork so that each cell can communicate to every other cell. So he knows that life communicates to one another, and it wants to know ahead of time what it's up against, so that if the waste stream changes upstream, the information of that change of the waste goes all the way down to the last cell, and it says, this is the information I'm giving you on the new waste and how different it is from the waste you've been bioremediating it. And he's gone into Superfund sites along the Tennessee River out near Chattanooga, offered to clean up a 5-mile-an-hour sludge deposit that's been an industrial sludge deposit for many years, only because the EPA said they didn't want to do it. They wanted to dredge it, so they did. He's gone into heavy metal plants that one of their byproducts from the jewelry industry is things like zinc and copper. Clean that up. Municipal sewage, just about anything. In fact, Ben & Jerry's ice cream plant up in Vermont has got one of these units in their facility, and the water from the ice cream manufacturing process, the industrial wastewater that is used to rinse out all of the equipment, the pipelines, the tanks, and everything else, ultimately ends up going through a living machine, and the finished water goes into the visitor center in a child's play pool. It's clean enough for kids to swim in it and drink it. So that's what cells can do. That's what nature can do. So the question you have to ask yourself, if you're loading your farm up with all these insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides, I think you better think twice about it, because if Pop is right and that these chemicals can scramble the light information from cell to cell in human animals, in plants, it is certainly plausible that when you're dumping tons and tons and tons of this stuff on this Earth's surface, that the information that the soil food web is communicating to each other, to the higher plants, the plants are communicating certainly to animals. You're interfering with all of this. And you're creating a great deal of inefficiency from an economic standpoint, if no other reason. You're creating a great deal of inefficiency in the farm, in the farms being able to be organs communicating to other organs and ultimately creating an organism. Now, at the University of New Hampshire, this is back in the 80s, they were doing research on the gypsy moth. And out in the Northeast, we have a lot of the gypsy moth. Of course, it was brought in by some lunatic that thought he could create silk, but with a bigger caterpillar. And caterpillar didn't want to eat just mulberry leaves, wanted to eat everything. So it took over the entire eastern forest, defoliated a lot of the deciduous and coniferous forest out there. And what they found out is they were doing experiments where they would expose the gypsy moth, or expose these tree seedlings in the greenhouses to gypsy moth caterpillars who started foraging on these tree seedlings. And they found out that as the feeding process increased in the greenhouse, that they could take the sap of the trees and they could analyze it and realize that the trees started producing unpalatable chemicals to discourage the caterpillars from eating them. So the message was getting out in the greenhouse. There's a gypsy moth caterpillar in here. He's eating us. Start changing the chemistry of the sap so you're less tasty. Okay? That's what was happening. That's interesting in itself. But what they also found out is the neighboring greenhouses that had the seedlings with no gypsy moth did the same thing. They started changing the chemistry of their sap. So there was a communication going on, not just within the greenhouse, but greenhouse to greenhouse. And this was published in American Forestry magazine. I saw it once, never saw it again. Diversity versus monoculture. I guess we're talking about communication. If we're talking about organisms, then we're talking about organs. And if we're talking about organs, the more organs we have, the more communication potential we have. I do some consulting work for a company I once was involved with called Earthworks, and it caters to this industry, the golf course industry. It's not a particular favorite industry of mine. I find it boring, but I do some work with them. I do seminars for them. I try to help educate golf course superintendents of the importance of ecology and being able to rely on biological methods to reduce, at least, the tremendous amount of pesticides. Now, these things are monoculture systems. It's all one grass. It's bent grass. It's a very park-like setting, beautiful, but when you recognize that many of these private, wealthy country clubs have fungicide budgets alone amounting to $40,000 a year, you realize there's a lot of poison being applied to these pretty places. On the other hand, here's another monoculture system in the San Fernando Valley of California. And I would say, of the two pictures, the previous picture is more palatable, not because it looks like a park, but because there's more diversity in that previous picture. There's probably just as much pesticide, maybe certain kinds applied on this. You certainly don't apply as many herbicides on the other picture as you do on this one. But look what's around. That place is a desert. That's a desert. You've got one crop, maybe sequential crops. Certainly in the temperate areas, you get one crop a year. And that's one of the issues that I struggle with, is the fact when you grow an annual crop, and I'm just giving you some thoughts here. I'm certainly not telling you that if you're a corn or wheat soybean farmer that you suddenly don't want to start, or you want to stop doing that at this point, but I certainly want to at least awaken you to the fact that an annual crop, 3 to 4 month growing, after that, what do you have? When you have polyculture crops, unless you're in the tropics, of course, but if you have polyculture crops, perennial crops, and I'll get into that in a little bit, you've got plants that grow literally year round and still produce chlorophyll above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot of production. But what we have here is a desert, and the toxicity level in this valley, as everybody knows it, the levels of allergies and asthma, cancer are pretty outstanding in this area. Conventional farming, 1 pound of food costs 6 pounds of soil. That's the price we're paying for a pound of food that doesn't even nourish us. Not only does it not nourish us, it causes cancer. Now that's a hell of an equation, isn't it? 1 pound of food, 6 pounds of soil. Now, on organic farms, and this is a more diversified farm, this is more of the farms that I tend to see, farms that look like this, but here's another disturbing, and this is good contour practices, as you can see, narrow rotations, plow downs, some pretty good crop stewardship here. But organic farming, 1 pound of food, and this is on the average now, costs 5 pounds of soil. So we made a 20% improvement. Now, am I an enemy of organics? Absolutely not. All I'm trying to suggest is it's the topsoil issues that we have to recognize. Now, here, keep in mind some statistics on perennials and annuals. A rye plant, everybody's heard about the rye root system. A rye plant per season produces a total of about 6,000 miles of roots. Now, that's not 6,000 miles you'll measure. That's 6,000 miles of roots that are produced and they die back, they produce and they die back, and so on. This is like a pulsing. The roots grow and then they die back, and they grow and they die back. And that's primarily to create food for the soil food web so that the plant can get all its other benefits. That's a lot of roots, and it's like a heartbeat. This plant is growing like a heartbeat. It's pulsing, growing, receding, expanding, receding. If you pull out a rye plant, like they've analyzed 9 main roots, you end up with 18,000 root hairs. Pretty significant. That's 24 meters in length, and that's about 12 cubic meters in volume. That's a lot of biomass for one little rye plant. You take Kentucky bluegrass, which is a perennial polyculture plant that grows on permanent pastures. You have 122 roots per plant, 61,000 root hairs, 74 meters in length, 26 cubic meters, one Kentucky bluegrass plant. So what I'm trying to say is when you have polyculture systems, and if you recognize something that John Jevons of the biointensive movement in the Ecology Action in California said, is that unless you import fertility in the form of feed, fertilizer, compost, and manure, the only way any farm can stay sustainable is by exporting no more than 10% of what it grows. So what are we supposed to do about that? If we're here for sustainability, and we're looking at our posterity, and we're looking at the fact that our great-great-grandchildren want to inherit these farms, and maybe beyond that, if we have, as a species, want to look at the fact that we should be thinking down the road of maybe thousands of years, what does that leave us if we're only able to export 10% of what we grow based on the way we're farming right now? Because if we're importing the fertility from someone else, there's a deficit there. You might be increasing fertility on your farm because you're extracting minerals, you're extracting manure, you're extracting feed, and thereby the minerals from other places. But you're still creating a deficit somewhere. So the answer is we have to have polyculture systems that produce these massive root systems and these massive canopies of light collecting of leaves and foliage that can do what? Create light. Because ultimately it comes down to the electromagnetic spectrum that ultimately healthy organisms rely on vast amounts of photon exchange. Everybody knows I'm in love with these things, and it breaks my heart when I see farmers ripping them out. In fact, a neighbor of mine just ripped it out, a beautiful hedgerow about 2 weeks ago, when I asked him why he did it, and he said, well, it's in the way. Well, I know that, but I mean, why did you do it? And I was asking the wrong question. But hedgerows, what I like about hedgerows is that they do some wonderful things, including attract highly specialized herbivores. They're highly specialized to the hedgerow. And that in turn brings about general predators. And the predators feed on the pests in the crop. So you end up getting this symbiosis where the hedgerows aren't hurt by the herbivores. Whereas if you didn't have the hedgerows there, you'd get highly generalized herbivores feeding on your specialized crop, just the opposite. And so you have this wonderful situation where you've got, and from a livestock perspective, and I'll get into this hopefully today, if I don't run out of 2 hours, you get all this biomass that is incredibly good for the animals in terms of the amount of nutrient density. And I'll show you a couple of slides. Many that have come to these Acres conferences before have seen these slides on the nutrient density of native plants, I call them, or herbs or weeds or whatever, compared to domesticated ones. But these hedgerows create more biomass, also known as dry matter, for every level of livestock than any other plant. There's nothing that competes with a hedgerow in terms of creating more biomass or dry matter per acre for every level of livestock, from the microbe all the way up. And yet we never look at a hedgerow as anything except a nuisance if you're really a crop farmer. As a livestock farmer, you still don't get the picture. So at the very least, I would say hedgerows need to be perceived as a great opportunity if you're a livestock operator, and start thinking a little bit outside the box if you're a crop producer in terms of what hedgerows can do for you. Down in the Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest single estuary in the world, of which 80% of the fresh water that feeds that estuary comes from the Susquehanna River. There's 5 major rivers, including the Potomac that goes through D.C., that feeds that estuary. You find out that these estuaries, most of the nitrogen and phosphorus and surface water is removed before it hits the bay with the hedgerows, and 50% of nitrate in the groundwater that's within the reach of the roots is removed. So these are incredible filters. They're really cleansing organs of the farm. They are organs that cleanse, and they're organs that provide defense. They also provide the habitat for 250 species if you're in the deciduous eastern half of the United States, neotropical migrants. I was on a farm a number of years ago that was a grazing dairy operation for 4 generations, and they were grazing Holsteins, which is pretty interesting in that most of all the dry matter going in the Holsteins was grass, not grain. And I was intrigued with that, but they had bred this herd over 4 generations to be grazing Holsteins. So that's how they accomplished it. But one of the elders on that farm, grandfather, great-grandfather, happened to be bird lovers. And so they made a point of putting up tree swallow boxes all over the farm, about 135 of them to be exact. And what they found out was that technology, it's great. That's O and that's N, that spells on, just in case you were wondering. That's what it's. Now that wasn't that way when it was made, I can tell you that. Anyway, but they found out by looking through the research that 135 boxes of tree swallows and Pueblo swallows they actually had consumed 500,000 insects every single day. 500,000 insects. And you could tell when you're on that farm because you didn't get bothered by one insect anywhere, including there were no flies on the cows. No heel flies, no horn flies, no face flies, no house flies. And you could see flies here and there, but they weren't really creating a problem because their communication system was totally broke down because you had F-15 fighter jets flying in formation literally in V formation going back and forth over the pastures and the alfalfa fields, and you could hear their beaks clicking as they were consuming leafhoppers and weevils and all kinds of flies. When you got away from the farm and got close to the woods, out came the deer flies and out came the horse flies, the biting flies, but they would not come in the periphery of where those birds were. It was completely protected. It was like being in this aviary. I felt like I was in the San Diego Zoo. It was absolutely stunning. But these birds, and this is easy to do, these significant declines since the European arrived because of the removal of a lot of the deciduous forests, especially the ones that eat most of the insects, like the thrushes, warblers, flycatchers, cuckoos, vireos, and the tanagers. So 40% of the eastern forest is gone since the arrival of the Europeans. The good news is some of it's come back up in New England because nobody wants to farm that ground, and Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And the existing forests, unfortunately, are fragmented. And what used to be the understory of these forests, and where there was some fragmentation in the savanna, there used to be a savanna roughly from western Pennsylvania and Ohio all the way out to Wisconsin. And these understory trees, the Osage orange, persimmon, Kentucky coffee tree, the pawpaw, and the filbert, produce some of the most incredible amounts of biomass that wildlife could consume. And this is some of the stuff I'd like to point out that C. Russell Smith wrote volumes on, that these plants, again, these native plants, were able to produce so much food and fodder for the native organisms, the ungulates that were consuming them, as well as the pioneers who landed there. I'm not here. That's it. Annual versus perennial agriculture. So I'm going to take a note or two here. There's a fellow up in Wisconsin by the name of Mark Shepard. Anybody know Mark? Mark's talking about this a lot. Perennial polyculture. He's specializing on cultivated filberts and chestnuts, basically as a cash crop, as a commodity crop for that matter, just again, not to have to plow the ground. And I like the idea. Thank goodness we've got people like Wes Jackson at the Land Institute near Salina, Kansas, that has a vision that he knows he'll never see. His vision is to eventually create cereal grains that don't have to be planted every year as annuals, that they can stay in the soil and they can be fertilized by a mulch of a living mulch of legumes that fertilizes the cereal grains. And it's going to have to happen because 70% of the population of the earth right now depends on grains for energy. Whether that's the right or wrong thing, that's the way things are structured. And so the ground's going to be plowed to produce the grain, whether we like it or not. And so his whole approach is, rather than try to get people off of all this grain as a source of energy, let's make these grains perennials. So I would highly encourage people to support the Land Institute, because they're looking at something that's probably going to take 25 to 50 years. And that, to me, is a real philanthropist, somebody who makes a commitment to do something just like the women's suffrage movement and just like the abolitionist movement to free slaves was based on the fact that those people knew at the time that they started those movements, they were not going to live to see the fruition of their work. And that, to me, is a real humanitarian. So I would encourage you to check out who the Land Institute is, read Wes Jackson's books, and realize that there is some hope in spite of all this darkness. This man, C. Russell Smith, or J. Russell Smith, that's not a technical problem, that's a J, I just called it a C. This book is a classic of all times. If you want to understand really what we lost here and what we have to gain back, and it's great reading, too. It's just fascinating. Those of you that are intrigued with Weston Price, and I assume some of you at least are, because you're going to hear Sally Fallon talk about the Weston A. Price Foundation and the work that he's done. But this guy was the, you might say, the agronomic or horticultural analog to Weston Price. He traveled all around the world in the early part of the century, before 1920. He wrote this first volume in 1922, I believe it was, and then the second volume in 1950 as an update. It's an incredible book, and it's loaded with photos that you can see what was happening. But what he was saying was, he was concerned again about soil erosion. His big thing was soil erosion, because he knew that every civilization that failed, without exception, every single one of them failed primarily because of soil erosion. And there's even soil conservation. The NRCS now has booklets showing, sites of ancient cities in North Africa that supported 60 to 150,000 people, that the food literally came from around the city, and there's nothing there left able to produce any more food. And it was all basically on mismanagement of soils. But they dug up canals, they dug up all kinds of agronomic infrastructure there that was able to produce tremendous quantities of calories and protein in areas that nobody would even think twice about growing a thing there. It's just a wasteland now. But this guy knew it at that time and was living in the Appalachian region of the United States. And his thing was, the Appalachian Mountains have no business growing corn. We have no business growing corn. Corn, most of the world does not have the luxury of flat land that North America has. This is an anomaly. Most of the world doesn't have this. Europe and Asia farm on hilly ground. Ground is really precious in terms of slope. And so he traveled around the world to see how did people feed themselves on hilly ground. And he went to all of Europe, including the mountainous countries like Italy and Spain, Portugal, France, Switzerland, North Africa. And what he found was that people were using these permanent polycultures and getting two crops. And what happened was, like in the island of Majorca, Spain, they found out where they were growing a tree crop of maybe almonds. And they would have either a hay crop underneath that, maybe grazing sheep, maybe wheat. They found out that they were getting maybe 75% of the yield that they would get in an American counterpart of the wheat and 75% of the almonds. But if you have 75 plus 75, what do you have? 150. And you had all kinds of resistance. You weatherproof the farm because all crops have different vulnerabilities to weather, frost, drought, too much rain. So he basically diversified, or these people diversified the substrate so that they had a lot less vulnerability to the vagaries of weather extremities. And so as a consequence, it was extremely productive and extremely profitable enterprises in these places. And of course, we came along in the 50s and said, you don't want to do this. You want to use anhydrous ammonia, lots of heavy metal, and go out there and raise, a lot more wheat or almonds per acre at the expense of the longevity of the soil. So now, that's what happened in China. China used to feed itself, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but, it can't feed itself now unless it produces or manufactures, if you want to call it that, a reservoir as long as Lake Michigan, which is what they're in the process of doing right now. So here's a couple things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these charts. Charts tend to glaze you over, but you can see this happens to be a food value of the persimmon and other fruits. But you can see I highlighted apples since it's a common one. You look over here to the sugar levels, and then dates, one of the highest, if not the highest. You come down to figs, come down to grapes, and then look at persimmons, this wild crop right up there. Now, again, remember that feeding ourselves, feeding livestock, the yield limiting factor there, what we're after the most, the hardest thing to grow, the most valuable thing to grow on the farm, that the populations of animals and humans need is energy. That's the challenge, to produce enough carbohydrates of the right kind. Protein's easy to produce. Protein's not the problem. It's getting enough energy in people, enough calories in people. So you can see that these wild crops are very, very capable of doing this. And these are bulk fodder plants that the Europeans grew years ago, and because they're high yielders, and all of them except the sorghum are perennials. Now, I know a lot of people say, Jerusalem artichokes, are you out of your mind? That's a weed, and comfrey, if you put comfrey in there, is it in here? This thing didn't, it's that? It should be comfrey on there someplace. I think this thing cut it off. Oh, so the comfrey got knocked off. Well, anyway, comfrey was on here as well. And I've always believed in comfrey is one of the, if you want to grow more protein per acre, and I'm not talking about putting comfrey in as a monoculture crop, you put it in as a diversity crop and make silage out of it. You don't want to make pure comfrey silage, man. You'll have a mess because you'll have an aloe vera silo is what you'll have. You'll make gel, but that gel is healing. And that gel is loaded with energy. That gel is these polysaccharides, which are carbon. And they also contain very important amino acids called allantoin and chillantoin, which cause cell proliferation. So it's very good for healing the gut. You can put it on externally as a medicinal. It's also one of the few plants that's able to produce, vitamin B12 on the land, at least a precursor to it, because it fixes cobalt in such a way that B12 is at least possible, which vegetarians have a real problem with. Roots, if you're going to grow annuals, we got to start looking at root crops. A lot of my favorite books to dig up are these old agricultural books, because I want to find out why they grow these other crops. They clearly understood the importance of diversity, but this comes out of German text, and they knew that these particular roots affected these organs. Again, there's a relationship, and I would be, if you really want to get into this whole esoteric standpoint of it, it'd be interesting to see the relationship in an astrophysics sort of concept that a carrot has on the nerves, or parsnips have on the nerves, things like that. There's obviously some kind of relationship architecturally and biochemically and electromagnetically that these plants have on these organs. things I used to do a lot with animals, particularly the large livestock, look at livers. You can see the one on the left and one on the right. There's no question about which one you would eat if you happen to like liver. But the reason why I bring this slide up here is because liver is a real good indicator of whether or not the farm is successful. Now, you look at cull animals, and you'll find out that 95% of any animal that's culled because it's got a bad leg, it can't breed back, it's got chronic mastitis, whatever, you'll see the liver on the right. What the Romans used to do when they would go into new land areas, they would turn animals loose on the land, different kinds of animals, and then they would slaughter them, open them up, and then examine the livers. And that told them which land was good for what kind of animal. And that's so true, because we know, for example, sheep, you don't want to graze them in low, swampy areas. They're much more susceptible to things like liver flu. They like to be high and dry, you know. So they would look at this land, they would let these animals, turn all these animals loose out there, slaughter the animals, open them up, look at the livers, and they knew exactly which animals they were going to put on which ground. Okay, this happens to be nuts and other foods. There was an entire pig raising industry in the South, this is in Russell Smith's book, where they fattened hogs, and this was all done in cooperation with the extension system down there, with the experimental stations down there. They fattened hogs in Carolina, they fattened hogs in Alabama on pasture and a combination of either acorns, chestnuts, and mulberries. In fact, in some, mulberries were the best because they're 70% sugar. And again, we're talking energy, more sugar than a raisin is a mulberry. And they're incredible plants to grow because they get no disease. They have a light canopy, so they allow the light to get to the ground so the grass grows. In addition to that, mulberries are also incredibly high in calcium. The leaves are. The berries are medicinal. They're a refrigerant. Animals get fevers. It's very good in quelling fevers. Loaded with minerals. The mulberry leaf itself, of course, was designed in the Orient to feed a livestock there called the silkworm, because it's the only fodder the silkworm would eat. So it's very nutritious to produce high-quality silk. You can't produce high-quality silk anymore. You can produce high-quality wool unless the fodder is nutrient-dense. And so mulberry leaves are very nutrient-dense in fodder. So you can see the filbert. You can see, I got the highlights. So filbert, chestnuts, acorns, and just look at the sugars and starches. You can see that there's a lot of energy, more energy. In fact, where they grew chestnuts, they call it the corn tree originally, because it would produce as much energy or calories per acre as corn would. And yet it's a permanent polyculture, and you can grow other crops with it. And this happens to be grass. We're talking about ruminants, trying to get enough energy in ruminants. And yet if you look on this chart, this is the energy we're looking for in ruminants, is pectins and beta-glucans, the sugars, the simple sugars. And you can see, where do you find most of it? It's in the alfalfa halogen in the grass. That's where it's at. It's very much, it has just as much, if not more, of these important sugars than any other grains do. And this is what makes longevity in ruminants. This is what makes butterfat. This is what makes reproductive performance. This is where you've got healthy cows in bloom. This is where a dairy farmer has a happy time instead of having to buy a lot of cow killing starch from the feed mill and then have to worry about the hoof trimmer and have to worry about premature culling rates at 43 months instead of 15 years and so and so. Analysis feed of farm animals. I don't know if I got anything here that I can see. Is this a technical problem again? Oh, right here. I just wanted to bring up, this was the honey locust. I got an interesting story on the honey locust. I took my granddaughter to a game park one time in Pennsylvania. I have all these exotic animals there. And we were standing around watching these exotic animals, and the feed train came along. They came along with all the hay to feed these animals. And they were mostly African animals that they had in this one particular area. And I was standing there, and I was standing underneath a tree, and I noticed, looking up, it was a honey locust tree, and the pods were on it. So I climbed up the tree, and of course I started drawing attention to myself, and I didn't want to do that, but my granddaughter was laughing. And so I pulled all these pods down and brought them down, and I said to Sydney, I said, stick your hand through that fence to see what happens. Meantime, the hay cart was over in the middle of the paddock, and all these animals started coming around the hay cart to eat the hay. They took a look at Sydney, and next thing you know, they started all leaving the hay paddock and came over and devoured every honey locust pod that we could possibly give them. Honey locust is almost pure sugar. You can eat them yourself. You know what honey locust pods are? They look like a locust bean pod. Just grab them. The tip of them are full of sugar, just complete pure sugar. And they're tasty as heck, and the animals know that. And we just caused a stampede. Well, the guy, the guy who's feeding the animals, he's looking kind of weird, and he says, what do you think you're doing? Said, eating honey locust pods. He said, what's a honey locust pod? I said, that tree right there. He said, well, you think you can feed them to these animals? I said, what are they telling you? You know, look at the limbs they trimmed off and look at the fact that anytime the honey locust pod hits the ground, they're going to eat them. So they know. I mean, the hay that they probably were being fed was conventionally, commercially grown hay. And they knew the difference between nutrient density there. This is a study I did. I won't spend a lot of time on it. It's in the Acres article, I think maybe this month. The last 3 articles had this diversity forage stuff in there, and I don't remember which issue, if it was this latest issue or the previous 2 issues, had these charts in there of the nutrient density found in native plants, comparing it to high-grade alfalfa. And what we know is that these plants are not, I'm not telling you to grow an entire field of stinging nettle or burdock root. I'm just suggesting to you that when animals find them in there and they're part of the diverse mixture, they have every bit, if not more, of the nutrient density that any domesticated crop has. And so if they're in there in small amounts in a diverse package, what you've got is the opportunity to feed these animals medicinals. And they'll tell you what medicinals they want. Because I hear this comment all the time. Man, this year, some reason the animals really went after burdock. Last year, they never touched it, right? Especially after animals are getting over the winter months. So you can see on this list, and I'll just make a couple of comments, but you can see the protein solubility here is always a big one for me. Alfalfa is very soluble in protein, which means it produces a lot of rumen ammonia. You feed too much of it, you can have a problem with blood urea nitrogen levels, which suppress immunity and also affect reproduction. Look how insoluble the proteins are on these wild plants. That's one thing I looked at. Another thing I looked at is the nitrogen to sulfur ratio, which is an indication of protein quality. Very good sulfur to nitrogen ratios. The most medicinal plants had the highest levels of sulfur. They also had the highest levels of calcium. We're always looking at calcium as a source of energy because calcium produces calcium pectate. That other slide I showed you, pectins, beta-glucans. You need calcium to make pectins and beta-glucans. So I look at the calcium levels in forages, and you can see how high they are on some of these plants, and the sulfur levels, and the zinc and the trace elements. Extremely nutrient-dense stuff. And on top of that, on top of all of this nutrient density, you get medicine because most of these herbs are medicinal. And all you got to do is look in a botanical medical book, and you'll see all the phytochemicals, or you can go to James Duke, his website at USDA, and look at all the phytochemicals that he's itemized, enumerated in the studies that he's done on all these plants. So all these plants are loaded with substance, and animals need it. They really need it, and they'll be much healthier and happier because of it. Here's these are more of the woody plants, and again, you know, you can see the levels of calcium really jump up, particularly on the mulberry leaf. Here's mulberry leaf right here, 3%. You never get calcium in 2% on alfalfa, 1.5, 1 point. Look at wild grape leaf, 1.9, almost 2%. Willow leaf is also loaded in sulfur. I love willows. There's hundreds of varieties of willows, and you can produce more dry matter per acre with cultivated willows than any other crop. That's a fact, Jack. Willows are amazing. They produce salicylic acid, which, well, not really salicylic acid, but salicin, which is a precursor to salicylic acid, which they make aspirin out of. And so therefore, it's an anti-inflammatory type of a plant. And when animals aren't feeling good, they really relish it, but they'll eat it anyway, all times of the year. So what we're trying to look at is this farm being an edible landscape, not just a house, but we want, particularly for livestock, if we could at least look at livestock with diversity. At least open your minds a little bit about diversity if you have a livestock operation, because it's not that hard to implement and it's not that radical of an idea. Okay, next, it's form and function. So what we're talking about is architecture. What does this architecture mean? Why do these plants look the way they look? I mean, the DNA constructs certain kinds of forms for reasons, but nobody seems to know where all this information is coming from. You know, one of the reasons, again, that I want to see this kind of an architecture on a farm is because of the architecture above is a mirror of the architecture below. So again, permanent polycultures give you that opportunity. You know, I'm probably talking to a lot of corn farmers here saying, this guy wants me to plant oak trees on my farm. Was he crazy? No, I'm just saying keep the hedgerows there. Don't put any oak trees in the middle of your cornfield. Not yet. No, we'll get there yet. A couple acre sessions from now, we'll be talking about growing, well, maybe we'll be talking to Mark Shepard about growing chestnuts as a corn crop instead of corn, which is what he's doing, and he's finding out. I'd like to see Mark speak at a group like this sometime. He's finding out that actually from an economic perspective in terms of the number of field trips, and they're strictly selling the chestnuts as a commodity, and the hazelnuts or the filberts. The chestnut is the rival of corn. The filberts basically is a very unique plant. It rivals soybeans in terms of protein, but more importantly, It's the North American alternative to olive oil. It produces oleic acid, alpha omega 9. So a very, very valuable oil. And so there is a demand for these commercially as a commodity without getting into a real niche market or just growing them in bulk, selling them in bulk. That's what they're really after. They want to get on base and show that it can be done. And then once the farming operation becomes more and more acclimated to that system, economics start to go up based on lower and lower and lower input costs, less soil erosion, and so on. I don't know if I'm going to get this on here because there's supposed to be some text here. But at any rate, what this is the soil food web. You can see root hairs, you can see fungi, you can see those little white specks are bacteria. Okay, what's interesting about this, and I'm not the expert obviously to talk on this, there are other people here that are much better at this than I am, is that they're talking about 2 to 3 million species of these bacteria and a little bit less of that of the fungi. They've only identified and named less than 5% of these. So talk about, an internal universe that we have a lot of work to do yet. This is an amazing opportunity. Oh, it did show up. There it is. Yeah. 2 to 3 million species and only 2 to 5%. So we've got great potential that we haven't discovered yet. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here and a lot of work that will be done here. And the more information we get out of this, a lot more efficient and economical and healthy these farms are going to be. And I find it interesting. Again, we're talking about design and form. 90% of all plant species use mycorrhizae. I didn't realize it was that high. This is a plant hair root, and this green slime, is an ectomycorrhizae right here growing on it. And what you find is this is what we call fractal geometry. Fractal geometry is that when you take a particular plant or an animal organ sample, let's take a fern leaf. You look at a fern leaf and then you look at the little leaves that are attached to the stem. They look almost exactly like the entire fern leaf. And then you break that down, look at the vascular system. It's a microscopic version of the little fern leaf coming off the big fern leaf. So it keeps going down and down. So what fractal geometry is that the macroscopic architecture is built by, layer and layer and layer of microscopic architecture that looks exactly like it. So what this says is that there's some kind of formative force, some kind of architectural blueprint, some kind of message that's funneling out of somewhere, that's manifesting in the macroscopic that our naked eye can see, but it's going all the way down. And nature is loaded with fractal geometry, even rocks, beach coastlines. If you look at this stuff from a satellite picture and then go all the way down to the level of the ant, you'll see the same design over and over and over again. So that's what's fascinating about this, is that it's also very efficient to create an organ or an organism this way by building into itself, so to speak. So this fractal geometry, you're going to see it over and over again. I got a couple of other examples that kind of replicate this. And they produce this glue. And this glue is this polysaccharide again, kind of like this aloe vera gel or this comfrey gel, that coats the soil particles. And this glue is a colloidal substance. And colloidal substances, I'm going to get into that in a little bit, are basically the interface between two worlds. It's just like a hedgerow. That's why I like hedgerows, is because you find most of the life forms where two worlds come together. So most of the life forms on a farm are 2 inches above the soil and 2 inches below the soil. That's the interface. The same with water, where water touches the shores. The same with the interfaces of these little things within the soil. You find most of the life forms on the surface where two environments, two ecosystems come together. And these are colloidal compounds. You hear that word a lot at conferences like this. What are these colloidal compounds? Well, I'm going to get into that in a little bit in terms of what the water structures are based on and how silica plays a role into all of that. This happens to be an unhealthy avian gut, and you can see the rupture there. This is probably due to mycotoxicosis, mold poisoning. And you can see a microscopic view of this. You're able to see that over here? Mind anybody's way, just holler. I'm sorry, it was taking. But you can see the villi of this intestine, the surface area of the villi of this intestine. What do you see there are blood vessels, massive amounts of blood vessels, which tells you that the gut is highly vascular and that this vascular gut needs to breathe like any other vascular system. And there's a great deal of exchange of substances that occur at this gut. Well, these colloidal systems, these colloidal glues that cover the root hairs, we have a similar kind of colloidal glue that covers this. It's mucosal lining. In fact, it's such a fascinating substance that when it covers the stomach lining, you can have acids that could literally burn a hole through your skin. And yet, the pepsinogen and the pepsin and the hydrochloric acid that your stomach secretes, pretty strong stuff. pH is down around 2. And yet this mucosal lining that lines the gut completely insulates the lining of the stomach from any kind of damage. So these colloids that are constantly being made by nature have buffering properties. In the soil, they do things like they insulate the roots from salt toxicity, pH extremes, drought, too much water, fungal diseases. So we see this colloidal system, and what you can see is, one more shot here, is that this is a fractal design again. That's what you see is a fractal design. And that's how it's modeled. So now here's a blow up of that fractal design. You can see what it looks like. This is the scourge of modern Americans, or I should say modern humans. It's a condition called dysbiosis. And what that means is called leaky gut syndrome. And you can see the full bloom of the intestinal villi here, looking at the damage of the intestinal villi here. This is probably the primary cause of disease in modern man, is the fact that the foods we eat and the foods that we don't eat result in an intestinal wall that looks like that. We have no protection. We have pathogens and poisons that leak right into the bloodstream, and then you've got the immune system and the waste, the elimination organs like the liver and the kidney and the lungs and the skin that have got to deal with all this crap. And we're also not absorbing those nutrients that are properly digested from the stomach all the way down because we've neutralized the enzymes that ultimately fractionate all these compounds so we can get them into the system. So you can see, again, the way nature's designed, it's an incredibly beautiful system. The surface area, look how that surface area in a small intestine, you count the length of the small intestine, but you can't even imagine the actual volume of the small intestine. Just like the root hairs of the Kentucky bluegrass plant or the rye plant, it's the same thing. 6,000 miles of pulsation in a rye plant. You're talking about a similar phenomenon in the animal gut. This guy, Senator Hiram Bingham, he's the guy who discovered Machu Picchu, the lost city of the Incas. A little eye candy for everybody here. And this is back in the early part of the century. And when he was down there, he was kind of intrigued when he went to visit the city of Cuzco. Because you look at these blocks that the Incas put into the walls there. The small blocks, some of them weighed 20 to 30 tons. The large ones weighed 300 tons, these blocks of stone. And yet, look how they were cut. They were cut as if they were cut with a laser and put together. You couldn't even stick a knife between the joints without mortar. No mortar here. And everybody was intrigued with this. How did they do this? Where did this come from? Well, there was another guy, an explorer that he met that traveled on horseback through the rainforest and eventually got into a village. And he had spurs on his boots, big metal spurs on his boots that by the time he got to the destination, they were completely gone. There was nothing but the 2 spur supporters. Everything else was eaten up. And he didn't know what happened. And the native said to him, he said, "Did you go through a plant that looked like such and such?" He said, "Well, yeah, I went through miles of that stuff." He said, "Yeah, that's the plant that ate your spurs." And this particular bird called the pito bird takes that plant and it uses it and hammers it in rock, and it eats the rock, and it makes a cavity in the rock that becomes its nesting cavity. And they're pretty sure that this is what the Incas might have done because nobody's really talking about it. But they think that this plant somehow was used as a chelating compound. That's what it was. Some kind of chelating compound to soften up the edge of the rock so that they could cut it almost like a laser would cut it, because this bird is doing it with its beak. And it can actually make a hole using this. And the name of the plant is Harakeama. That's the name of the plant that this guy went through and he ate up his spurs. And that's the plant that this pedo bird uses to make holes in a rock for nesting purposes. So what is this all about? This is chelation at its extreme. This guy, Dr. Albert Schatz, was a discoverer of streptomycin. He was also an ardent student of chelation. He was very fascinated about how things became chelated, sequestered in the soil. And so he was studying lichen. In fact, in the Bible, they think that the white lichen might have been the manna because it's such an incredibly nutritious food. Many Orientals and Asians, Middle Easterns, eat lichen because it's got blue-green algae and it's got fungi. Both are very high in protein. This is symbiosis at its best, and this is also chelation at its most, into solution and make them, like silica, for example. You know, silica is sand. It's the most commonly found element on the face of the earth. When you have a good chelation phenomena going on with humus and microlife, you turn sand into orthosilicic acid, which is, of course, water-soluble and available to strengthening the plants. But this lichen is also, if you look at lichen up close, ever since I started reading this, it is also an excellent example of fractal geometry. That the largest floret of the lichen is made up of smaller and smaller and smaller designs, all exactly the same. And again, it's all about efficiency, but we think there's something more than efficiency. Animal and human manure, bane or balm? I don't know if balm was the appropriate word, but there's some people that smother themselves up in cow dung for ritual reasons. And again, this is about communication. This is about what is this stuff after all? And human beings. I'm on an environmental advisory council. And we just had a meeting last week about, you know, what are we going to be doing about, you know, the septic, these malfunctioning septic system, which guess what? They all malfunction. And we got into a whole discussion about how we need to start looking at composting human waste so that we can return it truly back to the land without poisoning ourselves. But the same is true with animal manure. Good cow manure, you know, is 25% microbes by weight. That's an amazing statistic. 25% of the weight of a cow pie is microbes. Now this guy, the dung beetle, thank God he came along. And Australia was an example where the dung beetle really was the ultimate test of what Australia was faced. When the English first landed in Australia, I guess it was around 1780 something, 1788 or whatever, they brought 7 cows with them. 200 years later, they had 30 million cows. And based on the amount of manure a cow produces, they figured they were going to end up covering 625 million acres of manure that wouldn't break down because the dung beetles that are native to Australia, and I think there's about 250 species in Australia, we're used to animal dung that's native to Australia, which is a dry, fibrous dung. And European cow manure isn't dry and fibrous, as you all know. So these dung beetles couldn't work it. And they realized that this manure was going to build over. Now, what happens with manure if it sits in the sun and doesn't break down? It gets hard. It actually smothers the ground. So they actually were savvy enough to recognize this. They went to Africa that has about 2,500 dung beetle species, and they brought back a handful or 2 handfuls of them. And they found that 3 or 4 of them worked it. And they, thank God they got those dung beetles in your country, or you'd be one land of BS, I'll tell you. So, not that we aren't, but, you know, we got other kinds of manure over here.
Hi there, just wanted to interrupt this episode to make sure that you have heard about our Acres 2024 Eco-Ag Conference. This year's event will be held in Madison, Wisconsin from December 2nd through December 5th. I think we have put together one of the best lineups for a conference in the regenerative and organic agriculture space. Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, and their team from Understanding Ag, along with Joel Salatin, John Kemp, Gary Zimmer, Mark Shepard, Dr. Nasha Winters, Megan Neubauer, Matt Powers, Nigel Palmer, Will Harris, Jeff Poppin, Aaron Silva, Austin Unruh, Andre Liu, Jay Fuhrer, Steve Diver, and many more. So if you're interested, feel free to give us a call at 970-392-4464 or email us at support@acresusa.com. You can also register online at acresusa.com/eco-ag.
So the other thing in Africa, this beetle, the beetle and the elephant are the responsibility for the true fertility of Africa, because elephants, which are ruminant animals, eat very lignous material, and they eat tremendous quantities of lignous material because it's not very nutritious. It's got a lot of lignin in it, so there's not a lot of nutrition. They got to eat. So they tear down limbs, and they're constantly eating all this roughage, all this browse. And so as a consequence of eating a lot, they poop a lot. And as a consequence of that, there's huge amounts of manure, and there's specific species of dung beetles that just follow the elephant migrations entirely across back and forth the continent of Africa that have buried all this dung over eons of time, creating true fertility because of this lignous material, which is what? Mostly carbon, and able to produce humus in the truest sense of the word. So the question on this is the American way of dealing with manure is move it and get it out of the way as fast as possible. What are we communicating? If cells do communicate to one another and they communicate to other life forms in their environment, what is this communicating versus what this is communicating? This compost is not just an NPK. This is an issue of chelation and communication. That's why compost, I think, does the wonderful things that it does. It's not a matter of fertility. It's a matter of creating ecosystems that create healthy communication to the soil, which ultimately communicates to those plants and animals. In fact, you can feed compost to a lot of animals and they do very well on it because the probiotics, the soil-based organisms, which are healthy, the pathogens that are destroyed in the process, they actually thrive on this. So we're talking about, again, an extremely efficient communication system here. Here's another example of something that happened in America that just sort of as an aside. Elms, we had the Dutch elm disease. We lost all of our elms here. Well, elms in the wild are monastic trees. And we fell in love with the elm tree in the United States, and we planted them in every city and every town all over, coast to coast, smacked them together and created a feedlot of elm trees. And when the blight came, they didn't have the ability to be able to hold off the plague. And so crowding, for certain organisms is just not a very good idea. And the same is true with animals like this. Hoof and mouth formula really includes not just the crowding, but toxic low mineral fertility. It also includes, fire engine reactionary medicine. And this is very much true in the human arena because our whole entire health system is this kind of a health system in human medicine because it's worse with humans because humans perceive hospitals as places to get well. We do. When we say we want to get well, what do? We think of a hospital. It's usually a place that you hope you don't die in. But with with farmers see veterinarians as something you don't want to see on your farm except maybe to have a beer once in a while. If you see a veterinarian on your farm a lot, you're losing money. Something is failing on the farm. And here we're back to the flu epidemic. Immunity doesn't start with a syringe. And if you look on the Dow, we even take better care of our cattle now than we did in 1913. Whose cattle? Who's we? Dow. Well, immunity doesn't start with a syringe. And one of the things that I've realized is that immunity starts with providing the raw materials for immunity. And that includes lots of fat-soluble vitamins and trace elements, which we have huge deficiencies of in this country. Just about 80 to 90% of the population is immunodeficient because it is raw material deficient for those things that are required to make an immune system. Selenium and zinc and cobalt and iodine and on and on and on. And vitamin A in the right form is retinol and the pigments that are found in plants. And that's another talk that I did last year. But at any rate, it's just, we've got this quick make a buck approach to things. And oftentimes these things do give us some relief, but not necessarily a sustainable solution to the problem. Don't shoot the messenger. And if you think about this, how come where this is going on in England, this incredible travesty, which to me was political genocide as well as farm genocide. That's what this was about. This to me was a good program to annihilate small farmers in the UK. How come nobody ever asked the father of ecological farming of England, at least asked, he's dead now, but why did they ask his research? How did this work where he ended up taking his own herd of cattle in Kenya and exposed them to animals, deliberately exposed them to animals with hoof and mouth disease, and not one single animal came down with the disease? Why didn't anybody possibly look at the connection there? Was that strictly a fluke? This stuff is highly contagious to susceptible animals. So here you have a guy, Sir Albert Howard. He wasn't called Sir because it was a polite title. It was a given title by the crown. He was a renowned scientist and agriculturalist who was given the responsibility to head up British research in Africa, at least in Kenya. And he knew that nutrient density in animals was all you really needed to worry about in terms of preventing these kinds of plagues. But no, they didn't go there. They decided to import the funeral pyre raw materials to burn all these animals and get rid of them once and for all. That's what it was all about. It wasn't about disease, and it wasn't about the pandemic fear. It was the fact that they didn't want to deal with the fact that small farmers were necessary anymore. Silica. I talked about that earlier. Silica, nobody ever talks about silica. And the reason why they talk about silica is because there's no money in silica. The most commonly available element, the most commonly found element in the Earth's crust is silica, sand, but plants need it in very small amounts. Animals need it even smaller amounts. And it does some incredibly wonderful things. And if you look at this research, this is European research where they were analyzing, because they paid a lot of attention to the silica levels in their hays and in their legumes and in their straw. But you can see the percentage of silica in the hay, where it came from, meadow hay and hay reclaimed from coastal marshes and from sphagnum soils. And you see how low it is in the sphagnum soils? What are sphagnum soils? They're peat. There's no silica in those soils, and you can see that the hay has virtually none in them. Those particular forages would not make for healthy animals. You need silica for a lot of reasons. One thing, you can't absorb calcium and magnesium without silica. Your pancreas requires silica. Your connective tissue requires silica. Your immune system requires silica. All of the connective tissue, like tendons, ligaments, all require silica. And you always know when somebody's getting enough silica because their external architecture blooms, it shines. Their eyes, their skin, their hair, the coat, the hooves, the fingernails. This is where silica shows up as an indicator mineral. Small amounts do great things. So our predecessors knew about silica. It doesn't fit into the NPK paradigm, so you don't hear about it in this country. This, again, is from, I believe, Germany. Old Germany, not New Germany. And so start looking at this architecture, and what do you see up here? You see corn kernels, tortoiseshell, honeycomb, and what you're talking about here is the miracle hexagonal. Spacing, silicate architecture, and strength. 120, these are hexagons, the classic being the bee comb, the honeycomb. But you can see we're talking about 120-degree angles. And the reason why it's 120-degree angles because it's highly efficient in stacking and spacing. You can get a lot organized that way, and it gives you the maximum amount of strength and the maximum amount of efficiency. But what you also recognize, this is the form, the actual architectural form, the crystalline form of the mineral silica. And silica, according to Steiner, was the light mineral. Silica attracts light. And that's why the bees are considered light beings. And what did they go after? They go after the bloom, which is the light organ of the plant. So we're talking about light now, silica being this. I started out this talk with photons and light. Now I'm getting to the end of it. We're talking about light here as well. But this is a mineral that is able in the right form when organic substances and organic processes incorporate this mineral in the right form and create this kind of architecture. You end up with this health, vibrancy, and efficiency. Now here's a colloidal. You can see this is a water bubble, a soap bubble actually, but you can see even in the bubble, we're talking about hexagonal sizes here. Again, now we're talking about the colloidal nature of silica. So again, colloidal meaning lubricating, protective, all the things that are inside the gut of the animal, all the things that are around the outside of the root of the plant. These colloidal substances are related to this architecture. It's attracted to water, silica. It's found at the interface of physical realms, like where a gas and a liquid is. So where is that? Right on the surface of water is where you'll see, which creates water tension. And also, silica is the governor of light, but also you'll also see that these clustered structural waters. You've heard of Willard water. You've heard of Flanagan's clustered water. You're going to find out that one of the things that they use, a very important thing they use to make these clustered water molecules is silica. So this is what it does. It allows you to create these micelles, and that's where you get these structures of water. Bovine buffet, animal indicators. And these are cows that are out here eating a clay and along with some other minerals. I've always been a real fan of trying to follow animals around and observe things. And what we see here is that these animals seem to know what they want. When they're ill, you can always tell when they're coming in the milking parlor, their noses are brown with this mineral. We've had some fun playing with this mineral. This is a geothermic montmorillonite. There's a lot of montmorillonites out here, and it's a wonderful substance to supplement animals with because clay is the bridge between silica and calcium. And calcium is of the earth, silica is of the cosmos, and aluminum is the bridge between the two. And so clay is this substance that we constantly crave internally and externally. And it has this very amorphous colloidal sort of property to it, which makes it healing. It also allows toxins to be absorbed and certain nutrients that are within its matrix or in the deck of cards, the way clay is structured, to be released, providing very, very effective levels of micronutrients to the animals. And then I just came across a book not too long ago, and I was looking for this book for years. This is an old book, Mineral Licks, Geophagy, which is earth eating, and Biochemistry of North American Ungulates. What they did, these scientists went all over the United States and actually started looking at these deposits. You know how they found deposits? The names of the towns. Lick. How many people have heard of a stream or a town called something Lick or Lick something? That's where they went. They looked on the maps and they said, we're going to go to all these towns, or because the natives that were there first and then the colonists that showed up later named these licks because they could see where these animals were licking up the stuff. What they found out was most of the licks were not salt licks. There were salt licks, and animals do take up salt licks, but most of the licks were not salt licks. They were these colloidal compounds that were rich in micronutrients, and to some extent the macronutrients like calcium and magnesium. And all kinds of ungulates, white-tailed deer, Rocky Mountain sheep, pronghorns, bison, and so on. And this was an interesting book because I never found anybody that did this research. I didn't even know anybody was doing this research, and it was done, I think, back in the 50s and 60s. And this is something I did discover through National Geographic a number of years ago. And this, as you can see, these are macaws on the bank of an Amazon tributary, and you can see the ball of clay this macaw is about ready to eat. And they're just foraging clay, eating it by the handfuls, if you want to call them hands. And they're speculating as to why. And some of it is like, well, maybe it's because certain times of the year when certain fruits are produced that they forage on, the seeds of some of these fruits have been determined to be toxic. I think it's a good theory. But it's also, if you look at it from the biodynamic perspective, is that feathers, the organs of flight, are rich in silica. And so I think they know they need silica in a way, unless they decide to become chucks or chickens and they just want to walk around and not fly anymore. Perhaps it's stay away from it. And then clay is a food, medicine, and cleanser. You can see some of the things. There's a painting of Jesus handing out not loaves of bread, but loaves of clay to disciples. This is a medieval painting showing the fullers that took clay. Fuller's clay was a clay that they used to scrub the wool with. It was a very cleansing material, and they also used Fuller's clay as a human ailment and remedy, ailment reducing and a remedy. And I think this saint here is called Saint James the Lesser, and you can see the Fuller Club that he has. So there was a lot of involvement with clay. I don't understand why the medieval people are always looking so grumpy, though. You look at these pictures; they always got that frown. I'm not sure what that's all about, but. And here's a picture that shows a scanning electron microscope of mineral colloids that contain plutonium. Now, this is clay picking up plutonium, and you can see the little specks of plutonium being picked up by these large colloidal compounds. And research by Lawrence Livermore team suggests that small amounts of plutonium can be transported considerable distances by groundwater merely by adhering to the colloids, because the colloids are what? They have an affinity for water. They're going to move. Well, they're picking up the plutonium, and it actually accelerates the plutonium traveling into the groundwater. So much for the theories of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Back to the future. I think that's what I'm kind of talking about here. And I've shown these slides before. All I'm saying in here, I could show about 16 more of these photos of the giants that I think we all are starting to recognize now, like Albrecht and Royal Lee and Weston Price and William Keenan, and this is the dairy herd of all time, the Carnation dairy herd of 50 years ago that broke all records even by today's standards, and so on and so on. I think that, if we're going to have any kind of hope and have any kind of optimism, it's going to be going back to the future. And this is sort of some of the Back to the Future. You can see these Irish round towers, which is a beautiful photograph. And here again, we're talking about cosmic communication. Those towers is a Phil Callahan talk, so I'm not going to go there since he's the guy who really knows this stuff inside and out. But I found it interesting that one of the things that was discovered about the towers, that they actually were treated as tuning forks by elevating the level of soil in the bottom of the tower. So some towers had soil down here, some towers had soil up to there, and it actually created a tuning fork resonance, and that's what they were actually trying to do by pulling in energies out of the cosmic realm. This is Slovenia, and again, we're talking about bio-intensive agriculture. These soils have been farmed for thousands of years, and they still have them. Some of the soils in Yugoslavia are still anywhere from 40 to 100 feet deep topsoil. In fact, a number of years ago in the 70s, the Japanese actually almost, thank goodness they didn't, came in there and wanted to set up a corporate type farming system in Yugoslavia for strictly exporting food to Japan, and it never materialized. But these countries have been kept intact because they have been farming lightly on the land. And then, of course, this is Japan, which has been farming for at least 4,000 years. As Frank King's book shows you, farmers of 40 centuries. When King went over there, he was another traveling journalist and researcher like Weston Price and like Russell Smith were. And he found that this is an incredible photojournalist book, too. You can get, I think, through Acres. I think you can get it through Acres. But it's an incredible story. And yet, in 1950, the Chinese adopted Western agricultural practices. And now 1/3 of their land has been destroyed. And they're not able to feed anybody unless they either start importing fertility, importing food, damming up huge river valleys that are probably going to be a disaster ecologically and practically, cost-wise, because they let all that topsoil go. So I'll finish it up with this, which is, I think, really where we're at again. We'll come right back to the beginning of that which is lacking in the present world is a profound knowledge of the nature of things. And I don't know how much time I have left, but if I do, I'll take a question or two. And if I don't, I thank you for your attention and your patience, and welcome to Acres USA.
Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Kennedy Stroessel and Weston Larson of Acres USA. And we're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.